about $1 million over 15 years and $1,720,000 if you issued it over 20 years. Now there's strategies to really get involved here. I'm not going to get into those, but one of the strategies is this debt service extension base increases each year, just like your operating levy. You get to increase it with the CPI, Consumer Price Index. Consumer Price Index was 1.7 this year. Next year it's 1.5. All right, so your levy, your operating levy, can go up that much, and the same happens with this debt service extension base. So you'll have your future ability to be larger as time goes on. But there's strategies that you might want to issue these over every 5 years, or and develop some other strategies. But it's going to we need to look at the capital improvement plan and see when things need to be done, or when you'd like things to be done, and then get a financing plan. And part of the financing plan will be these limited tax bonds to some degree. All right. The next page is your other option, a GO referendum bonds. Now this park district, we've worked with this park district, the last 20 years. You've had some referendums that haven't passed. But in 2000, you had a referendum for open space and some other improvements that passed. It was a $5,925,000 referendum that was passed in 2000. And those bonds are going to be paid off in a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. If you look at the blue sheet again, in column 4 on the blue sheet, I used to be a teacher, so I see whether you're looking at the blue sheet.
I still had my eyes on $640,000 for the borrow.
Okay, all right. Anyway, so on the blue sheet, if you look at column 4, you can see the levies for the referendum approved bonds in 2000. The last year of that levy is 2016. And it's $659,000. After that, the total levies dropped from $844,000 in column 5 down to $184,000. So at that particular time, you can either, that could be a time when you might want to look at a referendum or something else. It could be a referendum for a bond issue, it could be a referendum to increase your debt service extension base or something else. Or you can do nothing, and then the taxes will go down. The taxes would go down about $30 for this $300,000 house. Okay? But you need to look at it as you're doing this planning. This could be a thing that you might look at. Referendums are usually for larger projects, more major projects that you might not be able to do with these other methods and with your wherewithal. Okay? So on the referendum, what I just showed here is your ability to issue bonds on a referendum without increasing taxes, because these bonds are coming on. You could issue about $7.7 million over 15 years, or about $9.4 million over 20 years, with assuming a levy of $640,000. The last year the levy is like $659,000. So I just figured it out. So, and this is often done with park districts or school districts or libraries, for that matter. One bond's coming off. If you need to fund capital improvements, sometimes you can look at it. Just an option, another option for the park district. How are we doing? Okay. Now this one, you're going to absorb a lot of this, and you'll need to hear it again as time goes on, as further planning takes place, as you look at your capital improvement plan. So you've got a lot of options here. As I look at your finances, your general fund and your recreation fund are in great shape. You got good fund balances. You actually probably have some money in those fund balances that you could use for projects. You have a AA rating. One of the reasons you have a AA credit rating is because you've got these good fund balances. But you can still, if you maintain like a 6-month fund balance, you can still retain and keep that AA rating. So you do have, you have some cash options as well as the borrowing options. Okay?
So what's holding on the spot? What's holding us up from not being AAA?
Well, there's a lot of things that go into a rating. One of the things is your financial position, that sort of thing. You're doing real well there. Another thing that goes into it is management of the park district and measuring the management of an entity and the board, for that matter. And the third thing is a lot of these social economic characteristics in the economy, the local economy, and demographic information. You know, what's the average home, what's the average income, all those kind of things. So, if anything, that might be the thing that might hold you back. There are AAA rated issuers. We work with Glenview Park District. They're a AAA issuer. You know, there are others. You know, City of Naperville is a AAA. So they also look at things like debt, how much debt you have, how much debt you're amortizing, how fast you pay off your debt, those kind of things. But the AA or even a AA plus is kind of, you know, that is a very good place to be, because you can say if you're in the A category, that's probably a 1/4% on up difference between an A-rated bond and a AA. In other words, you're going to have a 1/4% lower interest rate if you're AA versus an A-rated bond. So it means, you know, savings. It also means the ability to borrow more money, you know, with these constraints. So, other questions? Okay.
Just one other thing I'd like to mention. I think what Steve and I have shown you tonight is that you do have a lot of options available to you. What I would suggest, and I know from talking to Rich that this is what you're doing, you need to start with that capital plan. I have clients that call me every once in a while, and like you, where you had those referendum bonds falling off in 2016, they'll call and say, Linda, we need to issue bonds. And I'll say, well, okay, what for? What are you going to spend the money on? Well, we're not really sure, but we know we have to issue bonds. And I'm like, no. You need to start with the projects. We can find, between Steve and, you know, Steve on the finance side and us on the legal side, we can find ways for you to pay for it. The question becomes, what is it that you need to start with the projects and the timing, the priority of those projects and the timing of them. I know they don't all get done at once, they get staged. Maybe your financings, your borrowings get staged as well. And because you have a number of options, it isn't like all of this has to be done by referendum or all of this has to be done by non-referendum bonds. Or you have a number of options here that, depending on what your priorities and goals and objectives are, we can mix and match different options to fit the district's profile.
So with that, great section. Thank you very much. You've just gotten the crash course on high finance. And what was that?
You got the test, right?
I got the test after I'm done. Because now we're going to make you memorize all the numbers. So what the staff and I have been up to, amongst other things, over the last probably 5 or 6 weeks, is one of the things that the bond houses look for as they're selling bonds, as Linda said, is a plan. And the plan has got to be well defined. It needs to talk about staging. And when we talk about staging, we talk about if you decide to build a large building, using that as a illustration, you buy a house, you buy a piece of property. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is you hire your architect. Stage 3, you figure out as part of stage 1 and stage 2 what those costs are going to be. Stage 3 is actually financing the project. And stage 4, obviously, is the construction. So what we've done is we've tried to learn a logical process which can be changed and modified, and quite frankly, needs to be changed and modified every single year of the plan that will hopefully get you from point A to point B. So if you were to skip to the last page of the handout that we've given you, you don't need to skip to it. You've got identified at this time about $69 million worth of projects that need to be done over a lifetime of the district. Okay? 20 years, 30 years, whatever you as a board are comfortable in doing. And the reason that it's good to know what that number is because it relates to the discussion that both Steve, that Steve talked about is what's your total indebtedness. And it's interesting, I mean, I didn't do the calculation, Steve did. It's about $60 million. Right? So it would make sense that you've got over $60 million worth of projects, because you run a very large park system. 1,500 acres, you've got buildings, you've got other needs that need to happen, that are identified. So in trying to put together a logical process, the first thing that a district needs to do is they need to define what a capital project is. And I'm not talking about what a capital project is in terms of buying a truck or building a building or replacing backstops and things like that. This is a monetary amount that defines what a capital project is as compared to something that would stay in your operating budget. So in this case, what we're suggesting to you is anything over $5,000, and we'll talk about the categories in just a moment, we think that that's a capital expense. Anything under $5,000, looking at the way the budget here at this district is a little under $11 million, anything under that should be able to fit within your operating budget. The other thing that's important to know is that when you get your full budget, you're going to see two budgets. You're going to see your operations side, and then you're going to see this capital side. So when we put this whole package together for you, as you'll remember from the last board meeting, we talked about the operations side of what the park district does. You will see in the final spreadsheets, there'll be an operational cost to the district, there'll be a capital cost to the district, and the two combined will be your total budget for the year. Or as you approve it or modify it, or whatever the case may be. When we talk about land, we're talking about land that should cost over $25,000. That would be capital, capital land purchase. How do we define these things? Well, they have long, useful lives, 5 years or more. And it results in the creation of a fixed asset. So you could say, let's just use an example. That chair cost over $5,000. It didn't. At least I've been told it did. It did not. It cost more than $5,000. We capitalize the cost. Goes into the capital budget. That chair will last for 5 years. And at the end of its useful life, in the perfect world, we would replace that chair. Right? Now, we know that that's not practical in every case, because there are things that actually get in the way, such as what's the local economy like, how's our equalized assessed value program, what's our inflow of the dollars for recreation programs, and those kinds of things. And that's the tough part. And I think our two consultants today told you that's the tough part. It's the choosing of goods. And I say goods because there's not a project that's picked. It's weighing what the best project is given the resources that are available at the agency at that particular time. So how do you do that? Well, if you'll move on to, that's good. The first thing you need to look at is what defines a capital project. Construction of new facilities, remodeling, purchase improvements, operating equipment for machinery and trucks and all sorts of things, rolling stock. It's a huge budget. And you've had a chance to look at that a little bit in the material we sent out to the board. And of course, one of the things that's really important as part of the staging is your costs of engineering, of architecture, and those kinds of things. And those are all capital kinds of costs because it's part of the package of a program. So if you're building a large community center, for example, similar to the land that we talked about before, you would identify where you want it. You would start immediately identifying how much money you've got to deal with. At the same time, you're hiring an architect who you're telling you've got X number of dollars to build. So you need to fit these criteria. And then you're going to go out to bid on it, and someone's going to construct it for you at some point in time. Okay. So the next slide in your packet talks about how the plan needs to be put together. And this is what was difficult, if you will. And it's difficult every time I've done one of these. The very first time that the district really gets into the details of this. It's difficult because now it's how do we determine the goods? And the easiest way to do that is because there's always more good than money. Right? If you've got $10 million, but there's $20 million in projects, you've got to figure out a way to get from point A to point B. So we rate them based on criteria. And I'll draw your attention to your next slide, which is, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are the kinds of criteria that you as a board need to look at and say, you know what, that's a good criteria. We need to rate on it. Now I'm going to recommend in this very first one that you guys have got, that's broken out this way, they're all good right now. As you review the process over the next 50 years, 100 years, you need to indicate to your staff, and your staff needs to indicate to you which ones can be combined, which ones will go away, which ones will be replaced with something else. Because the economy changes in our nation every 5 years or so, that there's a new economy. And economies are changing dramatically every single day. So you have to be very vigilant in making sure, for example, that eliminates a threat to personal or public safety. That is always the number one reason that you do a capital project. What's your number one goal here? Public safety. Yes, it's providing programs. Yes, it's providing services and buildings and fun. But if they're not safe, you need to close them. Now, you don't have anything like that. But the fact of the matter is, you need to keep that at the top of your head all the time. And there's other things. It satisfies a legal requirement. ADA is an example of that, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes as it relates not just to ADA, but if you get a court order and things along that line, somebody sues you, you want to make sure that you're not giving your attorney billable hours, so you make sure things are done properly the first time. Sorry. The goal of every executive director, cut down on billable hours. Are you able to leverage public, private, grant money? How does that fit into the mix? Right? And so what I'm saying is that these criteria, many of them can apply to various projects. It's not that one project would get just one of these, it might get 3 or 4 of these things. You take the scores, add them up, divide by whatever the number is, and that's where the project rates out. Is it the best way? It's a way. It takes as much subjectivity out of the decision-making process as possible. Now, we can argue points, we can argue what we've identified as what we think are critical factors in evaluation. But I think at this point in the district's life, you need to look at these and say, you know what, this is a starting point. As long as we know what the goal is to constantly review these things. And I'm not talking about reviewing these once a year. I'm talking about, as we put in the memo, the management team that you have needs to review these, and they had a knockdown, drag-out meeting without me in the room on purpose, because I didn't want to be there, as they were getting some of these things resolved, every quarter. And every quarter, not that they're just reviewing these, but they're reviewing your projects, they need to give you as a board a report on progress. And at those times, they're going to tell you things like, improving the way the district operates, we need to combine that with reduces future maintenance and operating costs, so that it's just one criteria as opposed to 2 criteria. And by the way, the program that we had, we thought we were going to get it done in September, it's lapsing into October. Right? Because you need to hold the staff accountable for this as well as other things in the district. And the only way that you're going to get that information is by quarterly evaluation. You can't do it once a year. At that point, the day is lost. So those are the kinds of things that you need to look at in terms of culling through the projects of all the good stuff that needs to be done. The next thing the staff did was, and this is another one that needs to be looked at constantly, are these the right categories for the improvements? Does this need to be expanded? Does it need to contract? Ooh, did we miss a category? So these are things that the park districts are pretty common in park districts. So you'd have vehicles, you'd have equipment. The the difference between a vehicle and an equipment, right? A mower might be a piece of equipment, a vehicle might be a truck. Playgrounds and parks, and we'll talk about that just in a couple of minutes. ADA things, natural areas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you've got bridges, you've got bathrooms, you've got, waterways and fencing and electrical things and plumbing things. You need to categorize these things because what you don't want to do is lose your capital assets somewhere. Right? So at some point in time, I would expect to see this very, what looks to be onerous spreadsheet even longer and thicker. Because at some point you need to get in there and you've got it, and your staff needs to do this. And they've heard this before, so this is not a surprise to them. You know, you're going to need to figure out how many linear feet of copper piping you have in the district. Cities do how many streets they have and what's the number of miles. And they have a standard, for example. I would say we pave every year 5 miles of streets in our community. That's our standard. And then they go through a similar process that picks the streets that really need to be done. They do that with all sorts of things. Park districts do exactly the same thing. So if you've got 20 miles of pathways, and you need to repave or adjust alignments or whatever the case may be, you need to set a standard that says every year we do 2 miles. And we get the worst to the best. Because everything has a life cycle. So for example, a playground has a life cycle of 15 to 18 years. Right? Well, you can look at a playground that's 30 years old and say, hey, it looks great to me. I mean, the steel's terrific. It's probably out of compliance in a lot of ways. From soft surfacing, to the type of bolts that are used, to the widths of bars kids can get their heads hung up in. So every 15 to 18 years, you need to be evaluating that playground's going to have to be redone. And one of the other things that you need to look at is, when you're redoing the playground, should you be looking at the whole park? As opposed to just replacing the equipment. Because I can tell you, we have backyards, we have front yards. Flowers die, trees die, bushes die. So when you look at these things, you need to look at them in their entirety. So these are the categories, and we suggest that you leave it the way it is right now. And then as the process unfolds with the new executive director and staff, that those modifications are made as they need to be made. And that the board, again, is brought into that part of the process. Remember, you're looking at the top of the issue. Right? You set the policy. The projects are the projects. They don't change in terms of, unless you're going to build something really big. But the perfunctory work is the perfunctory work that has to happen. HVAC systems go up, every 20 to 30 years, depending on what it is. Pools have a useful life, 35 years. Yes, they can go 75 years. But at some point, you have to figure out when you're paying too much in operational costs versus what it would cost to build a new pool. Just using that as an example. But I can make a pool last for 75 years. Without any trouble at all. You don't want to do that. Maybe you do, but I'm telling you. So here's, on the spreadsheet, you'll see the very top part of the spreadsheet of this thing. Gets into some detail as to where the money is coming from. Right? If you don't know what your revenue sources are, this is a problem. Then you won't know what your expenses are, or what they could be. So I've highlighted them here a little bit. So we talked about, we've got projects that are revenue that's about $2.2 million. How did we get there? Well, you've got a cash balance that you're carrying forward from the 14 fiscal year to the 15 fiscal year of about $343,000. You've got the donation from the Riverfront Foundation. It's $126,000 to do the work that's in process right now. And by the way, that project alone is about a third of your capital budget. Okay. You've got a grant receivable, about $312,000. And once the project's done, everything's filed, the special audit is complete, the state will reimburse you. And by the way, those are the best dollars to get through the Department of Economic Support, because those are the ones that are appropriated in the state budget, the legislators can earmark for their communities. Speaking of buildings, you've got about $77,000, almost $77,500 in debt certificates. That's a revenue, because you sell those. Paving and lighting fund, you've got about $65,000 in it. It's a fund that you can use for paving and lighting. Now, it's a real small levy. Real small. So how do you leverage that with other monies that you have? We'll talk about leveraging in just a minute. The recreation fund in your 2015 year, we can actually recommend to you that you can transfer $781,000+ into your capital improvement. So when Steve says, you got $200,000 in your example, and when we met with Steve last week, Steve said, well, how much do you have? I said, I don't know, let's just use $200,000, because I'm pretty sure, the district could allocate $200,000 into a bond fund without any trouble at all. You got it. Right? A lot of this is about discipline. How do you discipline yourselves to make sure that you can keep the tax rates pretty low or not increase them for these kinds of projects if that's the bet you want to take? You've got to discipline yourself on the operational side. And finally, your special recreation fund, because of a carryover, you've got $550,000+ that you can allocate towards projects that have ADA kinds of work that needs to be done. So like a playground, paving projects, those kinds of things. Questions on so far? And interrupt me if you've got it. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So the projects, then, you have I wish it was 200, $2.2 million. It's a balanced budget. Now, we're not recommending, this is discipline, that you spend all of it. You're about $1.7 million thereabouts in actual recommended capital costs going into this year, fiscal year 14-15. We're suggesting that you carry over some, so you've got a little balance going into year 16. Right. Don't spend it all at once. Be careful. The more you spend now, the less you have later. Make sense? I don't, it doesn't, if you disagree, tell me you disagree, and I'll give you the reasons why you do this in your own savings accounts at home. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I saw the look.
Say we have 300,000 XYZ capital fund. But then, as you know, this park district continues to expand. And XYZ building needs to be built, or whatever pond needs to be made, whatever it is. And you're saying, don't spend any of your capital money.
No. What I'm saying is, you need to be very thoughtful about the amounts that you spend from your cash accounts. Right? Because once you spend the cash, just like you get your paycheck, once you spend that cash, it's gone. Unless you've got a way to recoup it. Right? So what I'm suggesting is you do about $1.7 million worth of projects in 2015. Leave the $300,000 to start your 2016 book. That's all I'm saying. There's a little left over. Take the pocket change and put it into the jar for 2015. That's all I'm saying.
And over the course of the next 15 to 20 years, you'll have enough for $69 million.
No, you'll spend that in 2016. You'll spend that $300,000 in 2016. But that's where now we come into what are the legal tools that you can use to do a bond sale, and how do you finance it? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I just, in the categories that we talked about, I pulled out the ones that you've actually got allocations in for next year, and that's how it breaks out. It's in your bank. So for vehicles, we're suggesting $171,000, of which $60,000 is the recreation, special recreation vehicle. We're talking about playground. Let's talk about playgrounds for $220,000. Now I could be off on this a little bit because the last playground I did was in Elmer's 2.5 years ago. And my recollection is it cost about $200,000. The other thing you'll notice in the budget is there's a 2% escalator on each of the projects moving forward. So we're trying to take into account what the CIP increases might be. And over the last 10 years, you guys can help me with this, It's been an average of almost 2% over the last 10 years. So it's never really gone out of control, and that's because of the way the Fed has been dealing with things, at least since 2008. So the last time we did the playground, it was about $200,000. And we looked at a lot of things when we did that playground. Playground